Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
You're here. Nice to see you. Wasn't sure. An hour early. That always throws me for a little loop. And especially I think yesterday with the sunshine, and it felt like, and then this morning it feels cold. I feel a little sleepy. The sky is gray. I actually really love that about a human heart, that it can move with circumstance. You know, it's maybe that's what a human heart is just movement with circumstance. So often we take that up as a battle, or we take it up as our deficit. You know, we don't want that change. But that might be just exactly what it is to have a heart, is for there to be feeling, for there to be change, for the gray sky to make us feel a little sleepy or maybe lonely, maybe time to take a nap, or it might energize you. Everyone has their own karma, their own way. Before I started the talk this morning, I wanted to make time available if anyone had questions from last week, the kuyo that we did for everyone who has died by COVID. It's kind of an intense thing, and I had talked about it the week before a bit, but then we actually enacted the practice last week. So maybe there's no questions, but if there are, I just wanted to make a few minutes for that.
Mm-hmm. In what context do they use that in Japan and in Buddhism there? And how does this apply what you did?
Yeah, well, what we did together last week, or what anyone is doing individually, hopefully some people made a tablet and that's become part of your practice in some way. This, I would say, is the fundamental practice within Japanese Buddhism. It's not I wouldn't say it's like this little part of it. I would say it is pretty much the most pervasive practice within Japanese Buddhism. And I would say within Buddhism in general. So to make offerings, and for those offerings to be something which carries our mind of awakening, carries our intention for liberation for ourselves and for others, this is the fundamental practice. And part of the reason that it has become so widespread is it is accessible to anyone at any moment to give rise to that thought and to express it through very direct practice. And that this is one of the reasons there are so many temples in Buddhist countries. It's not because that's where Buddhism exists, inside the temple, and outside the temple there isn't Buddhism, but because the temple invites us to make offerings. And so the very earliest forms of temples were stupas, and so these were places where sacred relics were placed, and there was a mound, a special shaped mound put on top of it, and people will go and they circumambulate and they leave offerings, and then pretty soon Buddhism shifted to places that are colder. Having some inside space is good, and we have temples now where there's an inside and an outside, but really this is a stupa for offerings to awakening. So then that then gets dedicated sometimes in very specific ways. So in this case, we're dedicating the merit of that to this great loss, which we don't know how to hold. I mean, if we think we know how to hold it, actually we're kidding ourselves. Real loss can't be held. It can't be kind of limited by holding. It has to be offered to and cared for. So that's the way. In Japan, what happens a lot. The biggest practice is people making offerings and dedicating the merit to their ancestors, their biological ancestors, and the lineages, the family lineages, are very, very important to people, and it's a very strong practice around that. Hi.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to share that after we were here, I had a Zoom memorial, I think at 1 o'clock, a dear friend of mine died about 2 years ago. This was her oldest son, and his sister had set this all up on Zoom, and it was truly beautiful. All long time, all these people spoke, and there was a bit of ritual, and it was this theme that had gone from morning to through this, and the whole thing. Oh well, it was wonderful that it occurred right after we were here. And I think the feeling that from all of it was just this flowing kind of love. And so, thank you.
There's a famous quote from Dogen Zenji that says, gain is delusion.
Can you say it a little louder?
Gain is delusion. Loss is enlightenment.
Wow.
And I think a lot of times we hear that and we can think of it in kind of a clunky way. But when we approach loss with the heart of practice, then there is a doorway that opens up that I don't know any other way that it opens. And the flowing that happens from that encounter was central to our tradition. And I can't believe how arrogant I was as a young monk to think that the funeral ceremonies that we did at my teacher's temple were like kind of the side business. And I remember saying to him one time, I can't believe he didn't just smack me, actually. I was complaining about all these funerals and we're just doing all these rituals and what does this really have to do with real enlightenment, and people aren't meditating and da-da-da-da-da. And he was so patient. He would listen to me go off like that for long, many, many times. And one day he finally said, Ejo, when people lose someone, there's a doorway in which they can receive the Dharma. And not to mention, that's what he had been doing. That was his main work for 40 some years by the time I was there. It was only my critique of the temple, but really it was I didn't mean to be critiquing him, but it was. And I never said that again. I never thought that again, because I could see the truth of it. And if he had not shown that to me, I wouldn't be able to be sitting here today. From the loss that I've experienced, it would have crushed me. Hi.
So I carried a koan from last week from your story of the phone booth. And people coming in and saying, we're okay. We're okay. This is happening. This is happening. And that just kind of stabbed me in the heart. Because, and maybe it's a cultural difference, but I feel like we cling to not being okay.
Could you say that sentence again?
Yeah, maybe it's a cultural difference, but I feel like here we say that we're not okay, or maybe saying that we're okay is not true. So I carried this question am I really okay? Could I speak into that phone booth and say I'm okay? It's a question.
Yeah. This is the question, or one form the question takes when that gateway opens, the gateway of loss. And what I heard in listening to that program of the people in the phone booth, it sounded so familiar to me because of all the many, many, many times I've been at a grave site, either as someone who's part of my family is buried there, or attending as a priest. In Japan, that's a way that people express that question of whether they're okay or not. It's not like an insistence of our okayness, let me control everything. It's not like that. It's like they want to set the that being's mind at ease. Like you can do what is next to do. We will do what we need to do here. And that was a kind of prayer I heard again and again. And it's different than the hubris to say like we've got everything nailed down, but more like encouragement. But I don't think we should force ourselves in that way at all. Like it has to be our own. It has to be our own. It has to be the movement of our own heart. And sometimes we're not okay. Not at all. That can also. That also must be, cared for. And I would say kuyo is one of the ways we care for it. It's not that we do kuyo, this offering, because we're okay. We do it. It's a mutual thing. The enacting of the offerings is a way that we create the karma, which is wholesome, and it helps lift us up, and it helps lift up those that we have lost. So we shouldn't wait till we're okay to do it. I guess that's my point. It's part of a whole movement. Well, this morning I'd like to continue speaking a little bit on the theme of the great vehicle. And it's been a little bit interesting to me. I've been having a hard time thinking about what I want to talk about. I know that seems impossible for me because my mouth rarely stops. But I am finding this exploration to be much like how the great vehicle is that this kind of very straight line thinking that we do around many things is not how the great vehicle appears. These great vehicle teachings or Mahayana teachings. And that there is this question that I was bringing forward a month or so ago about this issue of coming together. That the part of what the teachings of the Mahayana are presenting to us is a way of thinking about life in which we don't have to be right and other people be wrong. That our rightness doesn't have to depend on other beings' wrongness. Right? For me to make a good choice or a right choice doesn't mean that has to be in opposition in that way. And so a lot of the Mahayana teachings, they function through a kind of explanation that give us a different viewpoint. And embracing that different viewpoint, we can think about our life and practice in a different way. But I was also making this point that explanation isn't enough. That really the Mahayana is an invitation, not just an explanation. It's an invitation to invest in liberation, for ourselves and for all beings. And really an invitation to find our own feet on this path of the Buddha, the path of awakening. Right? Where do we find our own feet on that path? It's not just a question of how do we get our feet on the path, right? How do we point ourselves in the right direction? That's one way we can think of it. And then what we usually do if we think of it in that way is we come up with a formula or an exercise program, a spiritual exercise program of some kind, which is really good. I encourage you to do that, right? You get like, if I were just to sit down and be quiet for 15 minutes a day, my life would be really different, right? Or I'm saying you could say that to yourself, right? It would. If you do that, your life will be very different. Right, and the kind of spiritual exercise program there is very important. Right? So there's a whole bunch of the teachings that look that way or appear that way to us. But I've been trying to point out something else, is that our feet are already on a path. Our feet are already on the Buddha's path. This is what the Mahayana teaching tells us. So how do we know about that? How do we find out about it? Right? And how do we respect that my life is not that I need to chisel myself into some other kind of a hero of Buddhism, but that I need to uncover the deep actuality of my own life and how my walking is this walking of awakening. This, I think, was so profound within the Mahayana teaching. That in this case, these explanations, they're not to give us a way to kind of control the world or put everything in a proper context, but more they're explanations in the surface of helping us uncover where are my feet and how are they walking the way. I've been reading a book that a friend gave to me a couple months ago called Dialogues in a Dream. And this is a very interesting book. It's a very old book from the 1300s in Japan. And it's a series of questions and answers between a very, very powerful warlord. He was the brother of the shogun of the time. His name was Ashikaga Tadayoshi. So he's this very powerful warlord, and he was a devotee of Buddhism, and he was a student of Muso Soseki, who was a famous Zen priest at that time. And so this book is a collection of questions that this lord asks this Buddhist teacher, and then he answers. It takes place in a very interesting time that I think resonates with our place within the unfolding of Buddhism in North America right now. This is the point in which Buddhism had entered into Japan several hundred years before that. Right? Zen Buddhism had just come to Japan about 100 years before this period. And now the first really Japanese masters of the Zen lineages were starting to emerge as strong leaders within the society. Okay, they weren't these, kind of people on the side, in some little makeshift temple at 22nd and Garfield or whatever. They were becoming these leaders. They had the ear of the powerful people of the society. So in this case, one of the most powerful people in the whole country, right? Muso Soseki has his ear. He comes to him for advice. He comes to him for understanding about what his life is about and what he's doing and what his role is and what is right to do and what is wrong to do. So the reason I think that that's important for us is right now Buddhism coming into North American culture is, in the early period, which would have been the Buddhism that came with Buddhists who immigrated to the United States. And that's the long first period, from the 1800s up into the middle of the 1900s. And then after the Second World War, then there was more infatuation with this counterculture people who are interested in Buddhism. And then in the 60s, we see the beginning of Buddhism starting to flourish more outside of immigrant communities. And now it has captured the imagination of many, many people. It was not so long ago that one of the vice presidential candidates was really harassed for having visited a Buddhist temple, and taken some contributions from some Buddhists, and of course in World War II, Buddhism was completely disparaged by the Western press, right? It was the reason that the Japanese could be this scourge. That was the idea that the press presented. But now Buddhism has captured the imagination of our culture, and people are very interested in it. Meditation is very common. And it won't be long before people start listening to Buddhists. I hope. That's my hope anyway. And so I think there's some similarities here. These dialogues have been kept, and they've been read, and it's a very famous, I've never read them before this, but they're very famous and important presentation of Japanese understanding of Buddhism from this early period. It's interesting that the Muso Soseki wrote this with Japanese phonetic writing as well as Chinese characters, which the learned class at this time would have only used Chinese characters to write things. Any Buddhist text would have been written just in Chinese characters, but he included kana is what it's called, phonetics in his writing. The founder of our school, Dogen Zenji, also did that. So it's a kind of interesting, and it's a very similar period. Muso Soseki is in the Rinzai line, and Dogen Zenji is in the Soto line. They're different lineages. But that there's this attempt to try to speak to Japanese people, right? And so the writing style was shifting a little bit. Now, another thing about this I want to point out that's very interesting to me is we can think about this in a historical sense. I've been talking about that. What is a powerful person listening to a Buddhist teacher, a Zen teacher, and giving them advice about how they should live? That's very interesting. But what does that have to do with you and me? I mean, you may have more power than I do, but I don't feel very much like like a powerful person in society in terms of having that kind of standing, you know? This would be kind of one of the top 5 in the whole country of powerful people. But this is also a dialogue inside of us. It has to do with a question that is inside of each of us. There is a part of us which has efficacy. There's a part of us that does things in the world. We have intention. We have goals, right? We want to make a good life. And hopefully, someone like a shogun, that's their aim, right? Power not just for power's sake, but to use power to create a better life, for human flourishing to be possible, right? It takes a lot of work. And so there's part of us that's asking that question. How do we make life work? How do we make it better? How do we flourish? And that can also be in a kind of tension with awakening. Because so often we're told that if we just focus on the flourishing of a human life, that tends to just become greed. It tends to just become, how do I get more of what I want faster and better, right? Which we've become experts at in the industrial age, right? And so there's this kind of tension that's inside of all of us, right? What do I do practically to make things better? And where do I see the limitations of that kind of thinking, of the planning and work to make things better? No, Buddhism tells us there's a limitation to that, right? Awakening can't be located in just progressive betterment. The mind of betterment has a real limitation. So this dialogue between these two people is interesting in that way. Many of the questions that Ashikaga asks Muso are about how do we make things better, right? Or what's appropriate way to make things better. And in one of the dialogues, it's very early on in the book. I'm not so far in it, so it makes sense that it's at the beginning here. He asks Muso Osho here about the true meaning of prosperity. He says, "It is said that actions resulting in prosperity can be divided into those that are defiled and those that are undefiled. What does this mean?" So he's talking about flourishing of human life. And he says sometimes that aiming at flourishing, that aiming at prosperity, takes us down a path that is defiled, right? Defilement here in Buddhism is talking about afflictions, things that keep us from really waking up to the origins of suffering and being able to liberate suffering from those bonds. Right? So sometimes when we're aiming towards efficacy, we're aiming for prosperity, we're aiming towards flourishing, it binds us deeper in the confines of suffering, even though we may get what we want, right? You may actually accomplish the goal, but as you accomplish the goal, you see that there's this other kind of binding that's happening. So the shogun's brother here is saying, I understand this to be true. He's very wise, right? He sees he's got a lot of power, and he knows, like, yeah, sometimes I get what I want, but oftentimes it doesn't work out. It doesn't really address this deep defilement. Defilement's kind of a loaded word for us in English, but it just means it's laden with this grasping that keeps causing these same problems. It doesn't really liberate. But sometimes prosperity liberates. Sometimes it seems to be good. What's the difference? Right? And Osho's answer to him is very interesting. Well, interesting to me anyway. Partway down, he says, the teachings divide the defiled and undefiled minds into 4 different categories. The first is the wholly defiled mind, the mind of ordinary deluded people and non-believers. Yeah. You don't have to think of that as non-believers of Buddhism. You could, although it's probably the way he means it. One of the ways I translate it is non-believers is just people that don't believe there's another option other than just kind of material betterment, and then you die and do the best you can. That's kind of, for me, is a little bit how I interpret that, right? So he says that's a wholly defiled mind. He said the second is the wholly undefiled mind, the mind of the Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha. The third is the mind that is both defiled and undefiled, the mind of the Bodhisattva. The fourth is the mind that is neither defiled nor undefiled. This is the mind of the Buddha. I was so struck by this. So clear and so simple. But it tells us something really important. Now, a couple weeks ago, when I was talking about the Mahayana, I was saying this is really core to the Mahayana teachings, is an explanation that there are different kinds of people in following the path, and or different kinds of beings. And there's a Shravaka, Pratyeka, Bodhisattva, and Buddha. And sometimes these are also referred to as different paths, right? So there's the path of the Shravaka, path of the Pratyeka Buddha, path of the Bodhisattva, path of the Buddha. Ultimately, the Mahayana says all of those paths are the path of the Buddha. They're all the Buddhayana, the Buddha vehicle, the one vehicle of awakening. But they will appear to us always in different ways. This is a very important part of Buddhist teaching, that for something to be whole, right, it's going to show up as pieces to you. It's not going to show up as one thing. It's going to show up as the way that you can meet it, right? So here he's presenting this very core teaching of Mahayana Buddhism, and he's talking about it in relationship to this flourishing. And he's saying, if we're just chasing our goals, that's defiled. And yeah, you will make things happen, powerful Lord. But those things that you make happen will still be stuck in the cyclical world of samsara. And they will turn to suffering. That's why we call them defiled. Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, on the other hand, they renounce the cyclical world. They renounce samsara. And they cultivate a wholly undefiled mind. The Shravakas are beings that are awakened by listening to the teachings of the Buddha. Shravaka means a hearer. And a Pratyeka Buddha is a Buddha that awakens on their own. They're sometimes called a solitary Buddha. They awaken on their own, and their awakening is simply their own. The Shravakas become arhats. That's the term that you'll hear. So, ordinary beings are defiled, have defiled minds. Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, they have undefiled minds. The Bodhisattva is aiming at total awakening, not the limited awakening of a Shravaka or a Pratyeka Buddha, but the universal awakening of all beings. That's what it means to be a Buddha, is that all beings wake up together with you, right? There's no one left out. And so the Bodhisattva has both the defiled and the undefiled mind. A Bodhisattva doesn't leave behind defilement, doesn't leave the world of goals, doesn't leave the world of making things happen, doesn't lead that provisional flourishing of humanity in our case, because we're humans. At least I think we're all humans. I would put my money on it, but not all of it. That the Bodhisattva doesn't abandon this world. And to not abandon this world means that our defiled mind is also active. If we don't find a way to connect the defiled mind, the mind of grasping, with the path of the Buddha, it will not result in the awakening of all beings, because all we can do then is reject the world, right? We have to be cut off in some way. So although the Sravaka and the Pratyeka Buddhas, they provide something very important, and in the Mahayana, depending on who's teaching it, this is my understanding, is the Shravakas and the Pratyekas are bodhisattvas. They're kind of pretending like to be a solitary Buddha. The world needs solitary Buddhas. The world needs arhats. And so even not knowing themselves, they are fulfilling that role for the good of all beings. This is a common Mahayana explanation. But within the Mahayana, we focus on the bodhisattva. That is the way that we endeavor to practice. Having both a defiled and an undefiled mind. Now, this is the core of practice, right? A very famous line of Dogen Zenji. He says, we should set up practice right in the midst of delusion and become awakened before our own enlightenment. Right? Okay? Set up practice. Now, practice isn't just like an exercise. Practice is the activity of a Buddha. Do the activity of a Buddha right in the midst of delusion. Don't think you will get rid of your delusion and then you will do it. Then you will be able to practice the Buddhist path. Practice the Buddhist path right in the midst of delusion. In fact, your body and mind is just a playhouse of delusion, right? I mean, I don't know if you recognize that or not. But if you look a little bit, it's not so hard to see, right? And so we don't say, okay, delusion, you'll have to get out of here so I can practice. We say, I'm going to set the delusion up as practice, as the Buddha. Taking the delusion of this body and mind and heart and soul and setting it up as the Buddha, right? That's what we call practice. Right? So as Muso Osho here is teaching the Lord, he's saying, defiled, undefiled, it's not so easily divided, right? And the Lord knows this. This is why he asked the question, right? He can see, he has great responsibility. How's he going to use it? If he just says, the defiled mind's no good, he can't do his job. But if he just says, well, these things that are defiled, I'll just do those because what other choice do I have? Then he's just stuck in the same place to begin with, and he can't really receive the medicine of the Buddha's teachings. Because the Buddha way is neither defiled nor undefiled. The Buddha does not give the Dharma to the undefiled and deny the Dharma to the defiled. That's not the activity of a Buddha. Now I want you to think about this a little bit. What are the implications of not trying to dominate your defilement? Not trying to use a spiritual practice to leverage what is unwanted or feels unwelcome in your heart and mind, feels problematic. But to see that those pieces also must be transformed. Those are beings, right, that also need the Buddha Dharma. If those beings don't wake up, there's no Buddha. One of the great teachers in Japan, his name was Shinran Shonin. He was a founder of the Jodo Shin sect of Buddhism, a Pure Land school in Japan. And he said, if a good person could enter the Pure Land, how much more so a bad person? People don't understand what he's saying. Because the whole idea of getting into Pure Land would be like, you did a good job, right? You did a good enough job here that you could enter into a Pure Land and then reside with the Buddha. And in residing with that Buddha, then you have the opportunity to come closer to full awakening. This is the teaching about a Pure Land. And in the case of the Pure Land schools, they are devotees of Amita Buddha, Amitabha, who made a great vow to liberate all beings, right? And established a Pure Land, in which, in these teachings, it's said that if you recite the name of Amida Buddha, that you will take rebirth in that Pure Land and come to a great awakening under the tutelage of Amida there in the Pure Land. So many people practice this recitation of the name of Amida Buddha. Namu Amida Buddha, Namu Amida Buddha, Namu Amida Buddha is how you would hear it in Japan. One of the biggest schools of Buddhism in Japan. How much more so a bad person? Isn't it quite a koan, isn't it? If the good part of you can get to the Pure Land, what about the bad part of you? How is the Buddha going to teach you if Buddha doesn't teach that part of you? This is part of the implications of this. Now, in fact, as Muso Osho goes on in explaining this to Ashikaga, he tells a story about Amida Buddha. And he quotes a sutra in which this sutra is about a king named the King of No Thought of Conflict. And the King of No Thought of Conflict is a world-turning king, is what they're known as, and it's a kind of a celestial king, not just a king that rules over part of the kind of material human world that we think of, but a king that is like a world system king, like a great god, right? And these are described in South Asian religious world quite extensively in different places. If you read in Hindu texts or in Buddhist texts or Jain texts or other places, these are really important beings, right? They're very close to Buddha, right? But they also hold all this power. And so there is this king, no thought of conflict. And the king, no thought of conflict, has an advisor. And this advisor has a son who has renounced the worldly life, has practiced, and has become a Buddha. And the king, no thought of conflict, takes this vast area and covers it with gold and builds this massive tower out of all of the special jewels. And he goes there with all of his court, is that what you call it? Like all his advisors and the various royalty. And they spend 3 months there making offerings. And there's this beautiful images of the king places a lamp on his head and lights the light offering. And then all over his body he places lamps and continually burns these lamps, this light of wisdom, light of offering truth back to the Tathagata. And after this whole thing happens, his advisor, whose son has become this Tathagata, has a dream. And in the dream, he sees all the followers of this king, no thought of conflict, as being like boars and being like the animal boar and various different kinds of animals. And they have blood smeared on them. And there's a cart in the dream that's kind of clunking along. And so the advisor goes to the Tathagata and he says, "What's happening? All these beautiful, wonderful offerings that have been made to you by this king. And I've had this dream," because the advisor's a kind of seer, right? I've had this dream about this kind of horrible, violent life that these beings are living in, this cart that is kind of clunking along. What is it? And the Tathagata says to him, the Buddha says to him, "Well, this is what's happening. They're making these offerings to produce good results in their own life. They are hoping to be reborn into a heaven. They're hoping to be born into better circumstance. And that is simply sowing the seeds of rebirth. And this clunky vessel, this clunky carriage that's going along, that's a symbol that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. This is This is the small vehicle. This is thinking that spiritual practice is just about yourself. It's about getting rid of defilement and becoming the person who is no longer defiled. And as long as they sow that kind of karma, their life will be better in a way, but it's still in this violent cycle of samsara. And so the advisor goes back to the king and he says, why don't you give rise to the thought of awakening, known as bodhicitta? Bodhi means awakening, citta means mind. Why don't you give rise to that thought? Give rise to the thought that is beyond just your own awakening, but is about the awakening of all beings. And so the king goes into his inner room, and he concentrates on this deeply, and he gives rise to that thought of awakening, that he will be awakened together with all beings. And he goes to meet the Buddha, and when the Buddha sees him, he tells him, I see it's different. I see now it's changed. And he gives him a prediction of his future Buddhahood. And he says, you in a future incarnation will become the Buddha Amida, Amitabha Buddha. And your advisors will become Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva. And is the symbol of compassion. And Mahastam Prapta, who is the Amida Buddha's aspect of wisdom. And all of the various advisors and the court will become your retinue of bodhisattvas as you establish your Pure Land as Amida Buddha. Well, it's a nice story if you like those kind of stories. I do, so it kind of warms my heart. But I want you to notice something in this. He becomes Amida Buddha. Right? He becomes the Buddha which makes a vow to establish a pure land in which all beings are invited. Amida Buddha is oftentimes red. That's the color of Amida Buddha. There's a brilliance, a light, but also a wholeness and a connection, which is what this Amida Buddha's awakening is about. I think it's no mistake that the defilement of this king, right, his deep wish for the flourishing of his people and other beings, were tied to his bodhicitta. At first they were a kind of a hindrance because he could only see from that perspective, make these offerings and make things better. Right? That's the only way he could see it. But if he never saw it that way, I don't think he could have given rise to the bodhicitta that would lead to his incarnation as Amida Buddha. He had to care. Right? And oftentimes our caring also carries a defilement. Because we want this to be cared for and we forget about this other thing, right? If my grandchild can be safe and well, actually, the world, I care about it, but not like I care about that, right? That's a defilement. But there's also something important in it. And this is a quality of the Mahayana which I would like to ask you to investigate, not to be so harsh with your own being's defilement, with your own cares, your own. I was going to use the word obsession, but I mean like not so negative, like the thing that you really are invested in and care about. If you find your way with that. The trick here is, or the practice is, how do you set that up as the practice of Buddha and don't keep the edges on it? How does the way you care about your grandchild or your child or your lover, how does that extend to the world? and not stop at the confines of that being that you're grasping onto. There's a lot in this teaching about that. So I'm going to continue with that theme a little bit next week, and because we had questions ahead of time, we don't have questions for now. So if you have questions about that, hold them for next week, and we will continue this exploration of the great vehicle. This book, by the way, Dialogues in a Dream, is really wonderfully translated too. So if this kind of thing is interesting to you at all, I highly recommend this book.